She scrubbed toilets at Peterson Air Force Base, endured their snickers about her faded uniform, and kept her head down for 3 years straight. But when Flight Commander Torres collapsed during the most critical mission in decades, and no other pilot could handle the experimental aircraft, they discovered the woman they'd mocked for mopping floors wasn't supposed to be cleaning hangars. She was supposed to be breaking sound barriers at Mach 3. If stories like this give you chills, subscribe now. This one's going to change how you see the invisible people around you. Most airmen at Peterson didn't even know the night janitor's real name. Hell, nobody bothered to ask. She was just there every evening when the day shift ended, pushing that squeaky cart with the broken wheel, wearing the same threadbare blue coveralls that looked like they'd survived every military base from here to overseas. You know how it is with the cleaning crew. They become part of the scenery. Human furniture that you walk past without really seeing. The younger pilots called her Mop Lady when they called her anything at all. The maintenance crews barely acknowledged her existence when she emptied their trash cans. Security guards would glance up when she badged in at exactly 6 p.m. every single night, but never long enough to actually see her face. Same routine, same silence, same methodical approach to making their world spotless while they slept. Her name was Captain Isabella Izzy Restrepo, but the faded name tag on her uniform was so worn you couldn't make out more than "I rest anyway." Nobody knew she kept her left hand wrapped around the mop handle to hide the burn scars that traced up her forearm, like lightning frozen in flesh souvenirs from a cockpit fire over hostile territory that should have killed her but didn't. Nobody noticed how she always, and I mean always, checked the sky before entering any building, her eyes tracking aircraft movements with the precision of someone who understood flight patterns in her bones. Nobody thought it was strange that she'd pause outside the flight simulator room each night, just listening to the hydraulic systems cycle through their sequences, head tilted like she was reading something in the mechanical symphony that others couldn't hear. They figured she was just an old cleaning lady taking a breather, maybe admiring technology she'd never understand. What they didn't know was that Restrepo could identify aircraft engine signatures from 3 miles away, could tell you which pilots were pushing their birds too hard and which ones weren't pushing hard enough, could diagnose mechanical problems just by listening to the subtle changes in engine rhythm that even experienced crew chiefs might miss. Old habits die hard when those habits kept you alive through 2 decades of flying missions that officially never happened. The night shift supervisor, Technical Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, was one of the few people who'd actually spoken to her in complete sentences over the past 3 years. Not because he was particularly friendly, but because he took his job seriously, and that meant knowing everyone who had access to sensitive areas. Even then, their conversations never went beyond work schedules and supply requests. Evening rest, he'd say when she clocked in, using the only part of her name tag that was still legible. "Evening, Sergeant," she'd respond, then disappear into the maze of corridors and hangars that made up the base's operational heart. Rodriguez had tried making small talk a few times early on. Asked where she'd worked before Peterson, if she had family in the area, the usual getting-to-know-you questions that supervisors are supposed to ask. But Restrepo had a way of deflecting personal questions with the skill of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. She'd answer just enough to be polite, never enough to be memorable. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Isabella, Restrepo, had once been the youngest woman ever selected for the elite Project Aurora test pilot program. What he didn't know was that she'd flown experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was considered physically possible for the human body to endure. What he didn't know was that the woman he called Rest had once been considered the most naturally gifted pilot of her generation, someone who could make a fighter jet dance through the sky like it was an extension of her own nervous system. Other janitors on the night crew had given up trying to include her in their conversations months ago. Maria Santos, who cleaned the administrative buildings, had invited her to lunch exactly once. The invitation was politely declined with the kind of smile that said, "Thank you, but no," in a way that discouraged follow-up attempts. Carlos Mendez, who handled the vehicle maintenance bays, had tried joking around with her during their brief encounters in the supply room. His jokes were met with professional nods and quick exits. They weren't being deliberately unfriendly. Isabella just had a way of occupying space that made it clear she preferred to work alone. She was efficient, thorough, and completely invisible in the way that only comes from deliberate practice. She could clean an entire hangar without disrupting ongoing maintenance work, navigate around sleeping security guards without waking them, and move through restricted areas with the kind of purposeful invisibility that suggested military training. Because she had military training. 22 years of it, to be exact. The pilots who joked about her behind her back as they grabbed coffee from the break room she'd just cleaned didn't know they were looking at someone who'd logged more flight hours in experimental aircraft than most of them would accumulate in their entire careers. They didn't know that the woman who scrubbed their coffee stains had once pulled a disabled B-2 bomber out of a flat spin at 30,000 feet, saving a crew of 4 and an aircraft worth more than the GDP of some small countries. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was particularly fond of making jokes about the cleaning crew. Fresh out of flight school, with that particular brand of cockiness that comes from being young, talented, and convinced that your leather jacket makes you look like Tom Cruise, Morrison had a habit of loudly discussing how pathetic it must be to spend your life cleaning up after real pilots. "Can you imagine?" he'd say to his flight buddy, Captain Danny Walsh, while Isabella methodically cleaned the windows behind them. "Spending your whole life mopping floors and emptying trash cans? What kind of person settles for that?" Walsh, who was older and had enough deployment experience to know that life had a way of humbling everyone eventually, usually tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. But Morrison was the kind of pilot who'd never had his assumptions challenged by reality, the kind who'd never learned that the universe had a sense of humor about human arrogance. "I mean, seriously," Morrison would continue, apparently oblivious to the fact that the subject of his commentary was within earshot. "How do you wake up every morning knowing that your biggest accomplishment for the day is going to be making sure the toilets are clean?" If Isabella heard these comments, and she definitely heard them, because she heard everything, she never showed it. Never paused in her work, never looked up, never gave any indication that the words had reached her. She'd learned long ago that reactions only invited more attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted. What Morrison and the others didn't understand was that Isabella Restrepo had chosen this job specifically because it was invisible. Had chosen it because it let her stay close to aircraft without having to explain why being around planes was the only thing that felt like home anymore. Had chosen it because night shift meant fewer people, fewer questions, fewer chances for someone to look too closely at her background and start asking uncomfortable questions about gaps in her employment history. The security clearance required for janitorial staff at Peterson was substantial but not invasive. Background checks were thorough enough to ensure she wasn't a security risk, but not thorough enough to dig into classified personnel files from programs that officially didn't exist. It was perfect cover for someone who needed to disappear without actually leaving, and Isabella Restrepo had needed to disappear. 3 years ago, she'd been Captain Isabella Restrepo, call sign Phoenix, one of the most decorated test pilots in the United States Air Force. She'd flown aircraft that wouldn't be declassified for another decade, pushed experimental technology to its limits, and earned the kind of respect that came from proving herself in a field where being the best wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. Then came the mission that changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine test flight of the X-47C, an experimental stealth aircraft that represented the next generation of unmanned combat vehicles. Except this particular test required a human pilot to validate the control systems before full automation was implemented. The aircraft was worth more than most countries' annual defense budgets, and the technology it contained was so advanced that even many military officials weren't cleared to know it existed. The test flight was going perfectly until it wasn't. A critical system failure at Mach 2.8 turned a routine evaluation into a life-or-death scenario. The aircraft's experimental flight controls malfunctioned, sending the X-47C into a dive that no pilot was supposed to be able to recover from. The G-forces should have knocked her unconscious. The aircraft's design limitations should have made recovery impossible. But Isabella Restrepo wasn't just any pilot. She'd managed to regain control, but not before the aircraft had dropped to an altitude that took it over civilian territory. For 47 seconds, one of the military's most classified aircraft was visible to anyone with a decent camera and an internet connection. Cell phone videos appeared on social media before the plane was even back on the ground. The damage control was swift and brutal. The incident was classified at levels that made top secret look like a public announcement. Everyone involved was debriefed, sworn to silence, and reassigned to positions where they couldn't discuss what they'd seen. The official story was that there had been a weather balloon malfunction during a routine atmospheric study, but somebody had to take the blame. For the exposure. Isabella had followed every protocol perfectly, had made decisions that any pilot in her situation would have made, had saved both the aircraft and potentially hundreds of civilian lives by regaining control when recovery should have been impossible. But someone in the chain of command needed a scapegoat, and test pilots who flew aircraft that didn't officially exist made convenient targets. The inquiry was thorough, professional, and predetermined. Captain Isabella Restrepo was found to have exercised insufficient caution during a routine training exercise. Her security clearance was suspended pending further review. Her access to classified programs was revoked indefinitely. Her flying status was terminated for administrative reasons. 22 years of exemplary service erased with paperwork that cited regulations she'd never heard of for violations she'd never committed. The choice they gave her wasn't really a choice at all, except early retirement with full benefits and a promise that her service record would reflect nothing but honorable conduct. Or fight the decision and watch her reputation get destroyed by allegations that would follow her for the rest of her career. She chose silence, but staying silent didn't mean she was ready to walk away from aviation entirely. The job at Peterson let her stay close to aircraft, let her hear the sounds and smell the exhaust, and feel the ground shake. When the big birds took off for missions she'd never fly again. It was torture and therapy in equal measure, a way of staying connected to the only life she'd ever wanted while accepting that it was over. The burn scars on her left arm were from that cockpit fire over Afghanistan 8 years earlier, when hydraulic fluid had ignited during combat maneuvers and she'd had to bring her damaged F-22 home with third-degree burns and no feeling in her left hand. She'd been back in the cockpit 6 weeks later, as soon as the doctors cleared her to fly. The scars on her soul were newer, deeper, and showed no signs of healing. So she mopped floors and emptied trash cans and listened to young pilots like Morrison talk about how pathetic her life must be. And she told herself that this was enough. That being invisible was better than being forgotten. That keeping aircraft clean was still a way of serving, even if nobody would ever salute her for it again. She told herself that until the night everything changed. The routine at Peterson Air Force Base was as predictable as sunrise. Isabella would badge in at exactly 6 p.m., collect her supplies from the maintenance closet in Building C, and begin her methodical sweep through the administrative offices before moving to the more sensitive areas that required higher clearance levels. She had a system. Everyone who'd spent time in the military had systems, and hers was designed for maximum efficiency with minimum human contact. First, the pilot briefing rooms where tomorrow's mission assignments were posted on whiteboards that she'd clean without reading, though her eyes inevitably caught fragments of flight plans and aircraft assignments. Then the crew lounges where off-duty pilots left behind empty energy drink cans and half-finished crossword puzzles. After that, the maintenance offices where Chief Master Sergeant Patricia Williams ran the base's aircraft repair operations with the precision of a Swiss watch and the vocabulary of a sailor. Williams was one of the few people on base who treated Isabella like an actual human being rather than a piece of mobile furniture. Not because she was particularly friendly, Williams wasn't known for her warm personality, but because she respected competence wherever she found it, and Isabella's work was undeniably competent. "Evening, Restrepo," Williams would say when their paths crossed in the maintenance bay, using Isabella's actual surname instead of the mangled version from her name tag. Williams had sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and something about Isabella had caught her attention from the first week on the job. "Evening, Chief," Isabella would respond, then continue with her work while Williams supervised the night maintenance. Crews who kept Peterson's aircraft mission ready. What Williams didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Isabella had specifically requested the maintenance areas as part of her cleaning route. Officially, it was because those areas required someone with appropriate security clearance. Unofficially, it was because being around aircraft maintenance was the closest thing to flying she could still experience. She'd watch the crew chiefs perform their pre-flight inspections, noting which engines sounded healthy and which ones carried the subtle irregularities that meant trouble was coming. She'd observe the hydraulic system checks, the avionics diagnostics, the 1,000 small tasks that kept multi-million-dollar aircraft safely in the sky. Her trained eye could spot problems that even experienced maintenance personnel might miss: a loose connection here, a fluid leak there, wear patterns that suggested component failure was imminent. But she never said anything, never offered suggestions or pointed out potential issues, never let on that she understood what she was seeing. Because Isabella Restrepo, the janitor, wasn't supposed to know the difference between a fuel pump and a coffee pot. And maintaining that fiction was essential to maintaining her invisibility. The hardest part wasn't the physical work or even the condescending attitudes. The hardest part was listening to conversations about flight operations and staying silent when she heard pilots making decisions that could get them killed, like the night she overheard Lieutenant Morrison telling Captain Walsh about his plan to push his F-16 through some aggressive maneuvers during the next day's training exercise. Morrison was describing an approach that would put excessive stress on the aircraft's airframe, the kind of hotshot flying that looked impressive but shortened the service life of expensive equipment. "The bird can handle it," Morrison was saying, as Isabella emptied the wastebasket behind him. "These things are built to take punishment." Walsh looked skeptical. "Maybe dial it back a notch, Jake. No need to redline everything just to prove a point. Come on, Daddy. When's the last time you really opened one of these birds up? Really let her stretch her legs?" Morrison's voice carried that particular mix of enthusiasm and ignorance that made experienced pilots nervous. "We spend all our time flying conservative profiles. How are we supposed to know what we can do in a real situation if we never push the limits?" Isabella's hands tightened on the mop handle. She'd seen what happened when inexperienced pilots confused recklessness with courage, had attended too many funerals for young aviators who'd thought they were invincible right up until the moment they proved they weren't. But she kept mopping, kept quiet, and hoped Walsh would talk his friend out of doing something stupid. Next morning, she heard through the base grapevine that Morrison had aborted his training flight due to mechanical issues. His F-16 had developed hydraulic problems during pre-flight inspection. Exactly the kind of stress-related failure that Isabella could have predicted if anyone had bothered to ask her opinion, which, of course, nobody ever would. The invisibility that protected her also isolated her. Days would pass without meaningful human conversation, beyond the basic pleasantries required by her job. She'd eat lunch alone in her small apartment, watching news coverage of aviation accidents and wondering if better pilot training might have prevented them. She'd spend weekends walking through the civilian sections of Colorado Springs, observing normal people living normal lives and trying to remember what that felt like. Sometimes she'd drive out to Garden of the Gods and watch commercial aircraft tracking toward Denver International Airport, their navigation lights blinking in the darkness like electronic constellations. She'd identify each aircraft by its engine sound before it was close enough to see Boeing 737, Airbus A320, Embraer, regional jet, and remember when she'd been qualified to fly aircraft that made those civilian planes look like toys. The loneliness was a constant companion, but it was preferable to the alternative. She'd tried civilian pilot jobs after leaving the Air Force, but commercial aviation felt like driving a school bus after spending years racing Formula One cars. Corporate flying was better, but the background checks for high-end clients inevitably led to questions about the gap in her employment history. Questions she couldn't answer without violating multiple classification levels. So she cleaned toilets and mopped floors and told herself that this was temporary, just until she figured out what came next. That was 3 years ago, and she still hadn't figured out what came next. The base's social hierarchy was clearly defined and rigidly maintained. Pilots occupied the top tier, followed by aircrew, then maintenance personnel, then administrative staff, and finally support services like security and janitorial. Everyone knew their place, and crossing those boundaries was discouraged through both official policy and unofficial social pressure. Isabella existed so far below the official hierarchy that she barely registered as part of the base ecosystem. She was a function rather than a person, someone who made messes disappear and surfaces sparkle without requiring acknowledgement or appreciation. The perfect employee, essential but invisible. The other members of the night cleaning crew had their own coping mechanisms for the social isolation. Maria Santos, who'd been cleaning military bases for 15 years, treated it like any other job and went home to a house full of grandchildren who thought she hung the moon. Carlos Mendez supplemented his income by taking online college courses and planning for a career change once he earned his degree in information technology. But Isabella had no family waiting at home, no grand plans for a different future. The Air Force had been her family, flying had been her identity, and without those anchors, she felt like she was drifting through someone else's life. The closest thing she had to a friend was an old dog named Oscar who belonged to her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. Oscar was a German Shepherd mix who'd been retired from military service after losing partial vision in one eye during a deployment to Iraq. He understood something about being put out to pasture before you were ready. Mrs. Peterson had asked Isabella to walk Oscar when her arthritis was acting up, and those evening walks had become a routine that both she and the dog looked forward to. Oscar didn't care about her past or her current circumstances. He was just happy to have someone who understood that sometimes the best company was the kind that didn't require conversation. During those walks, Isabella would find herself talking to Oscar about things she couldn't discuss with anyone else. About missing the feeling of pulling G's in a tight turn. About the sound of afterburners lighting up. About the indescribable sensation of pushing an aircraft to its absolute limits and finding that perfect balance between control and chaos. Oscar would listen with the patience of someone who'd seen his share of human struggles and learned that sometimes all you could do was be present while people worked through their pain. The dog had been a military working dog, and Isabella could see traces of his training in the way he carried himself, the way he automatically checked his surroundings, the way he positioned himself to watch her six while they walked. They were both veterans trying to figure out how to exist in a world that no longer needed their particular skills. Base housing for support staff was functional, but Sterile small apartments and converted barracks buildings that housed everyone, from junior enlisted personnel to civilian contractors. Isabella's unit was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the flight line that she both treasured and dreaded. She could watch aircraft operations from her kitchen window, could see the morning launches and evening recoveries that marked the rhythm of operational life. Sometimes she'd stand at that window with a cup of coffee and track the aircraft movements, noting which pilots were flying tight patterns and which ones were sloppy with their approaches. Old habits were hard to break, and situational awareness had been drilled into her so thoroughly that she couldn't stop analyzing what she saw. Even when the information served no purpose, the apartment itself was Spartan by choice rather than necessity. Her Air Force salary had included hazard pay and flight pay that left her with substantial savings, and the janitor position paid well enough to cover her modest expenses. She could have afforded a nicer place off base, but staying at Peterson kept her close to the only world she'd ever really understood. Her decorations were minimal: a small bookshelf filled with technical manuals and aviation biographies, a desk where she kept her laptop and paid bills, a few photographs of aircraft she'd flown back when she was someone who mattered. No family photos, no personal mementos, nothing that would help a visitor understand who she'd been before she became invisible. The photographs were her one concession to nostalgia, her and her F-22 after a successful test flight. The X-47C prototype. During ground testing, a group shot with her test pilot class, all of them young and confident and convinced they were part of something important. She'd hidden these photos in a drawer after the first month, then gradually moved them back out as she accepted that this was her life now. Looking at them reminded her of what she'd lost, but it also reminded her of what she'd accomplished. For 22 years, she'd been excellent at something that mattered. For 22 years, she'd pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. The fact that it had ended badly didn't erase the fact that it had happened at all. Even if nobody at Peterson Air Force Base would ever know that the woman who cleaned their toilets had once been among the best pilots in the world. The subtle signs were everywhere once you knew how to look for them, but nobody at Peterson was looking. They saw what they expected to see: a middle-aged woman in coveralls pushing a mop bucket, and their brains filled in the rest with assumptions about education, background, and capability that couldn't have been more wrong. Isabella's posture was the first tell, though it would take someone with military experience to recognize it. Even after 3 years of deliberate invisibility, she still carried herself like an officer. The straight spine, the measured stride, the way she automatically positioned herself to maintain visual contact with exits and potential threats. Janitors didn't typically demonstrate the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of tactical training, but Isabella couldn't completely suppress decades of muscle memory. When aircraft engines fired up on the flight line, she'd pause in her work just for a split second and tilt her head at an angle that suggested she was analyzing more than just noise. Her eyes would track the aircraft's movement with the precision of someone who understood flight dynamics intimately, noting details about engine performance, takeoff procedures, and pilot technique that would be meaningless to civilian observers. Maintenance crews occasionally noticed her unusual interest in their work, but they attributed it to normal curiosity rather than professional expertise. She'd linger near open engine compartments just long enough to assess the condition of components she recognized, then move on before anyone questioned her presence. Her cleaning route just happened to take her past the aircraft maintenance schedules posted in Chief Williams' office, and she'd memorized the information while wiping down the whiteboard. Technical. Sergeant Rodriguez had started to wonder about some of Isabella's habits after watching her work for several months, like the way she automatically avoided walking under aircraft wings, even when they were securely supported on maintenance stands, or how she instinctively gave wide berth to intake areas, even on aircraft that weren't running. These were safety behaviors drilled into aircrew and maintenance personnel, not typical knowledge for civilian cleaning staff. But Rodriguez had enough on his plate, managing night shift operations without investigating the personal history of a janitor who did excellent work and never caused problems. If Rest wanted to be mysterious about her background, that was her business as long as she kept the facilities spotless and maintained her security clearance. Isabella's knowledge extended far beyond basic aircraft recognition. She could identify specific variants of military aircraft by subtle differences in external configuration that most people wouldn't notice. The slight modifications to engine intakes that distinguished an F-16C from an F-16D, the antenna arrangements that marked different electronic warfare suites, the external fuel tank configurations that indicated specific mission profiles. When she cleaned the pilot briefing rooms, she'd unconsciously evaluate the mission parameters written on the whiteboards. Not reading them deliberately, that would have been a security violation, but her trained eye would catch details about altitude profiles, weapons loadouts, and formation flying that triggered automatic analysis. She'd find herself mentally calculating fuel consumption rates, assessing weather factors, and identifying potential tactical problems with the planned routes. The irony was bitter and constant. She was probably the most qualified person on base to evaluate flight safety issues, but her input would never be requested or welcome. The pilots she observed making questionable decisions would never know that the cleaning lady mopping behind them had more flight hours in experimental aircraft than most of them had in simulators. Lieutenant Morrison's flying habits particularly concerned her. She'd overheard enough conversations to know that he had a reputation for pushing boundaries and showing off during training exercises. His approach to aviation reminded her of pilots she'd known early in her career, talented but overconfident, skilled but lacking the humility that came from understanding how quickly things could go wrong at high altitude and high speed. During one of her evening cleaning rounds, she'd found a flight manual left open on a table in the pilot lounge. Morrison had been studying aggressive maneuvering techniques based on the highlighted sections and handwritten notes in the margins. The specific passages he'd marked dealt with high G turns and recovery procedures from unusual attitudes, advanced techniques that required extensive training and experience to execute safely. Isabella had spent years mastering those exact maneuvers in aircraft far more sophisticated than the F-16 stationed at Peterson. She knew the physical demands they placed on both pilot and aircraft, the narrow margins for error, the split-second timing required to avoid catastrophic failure. Morrison's notes suggested he was planning to attempt maneuvers that would challenge even experienced test pilots, but she couldn't warn him, couldn't suggest that he seek additional training or reconsider his approach, couldn't share the hard-earned wisdom that might prevent him from becoming another statistic in the long history of aviation accidents caused by pilot overconfidence. So she closed the manual, finished cleaning the table, and hoped that Morrison's natural talent would compensate for his lack of judgment. The base's flight operations followed predictable patterns that Isabella had memorized within her first month on the job. Morning launches typically began at 0600, with different squadrons rotating through training exercises throughout the day. Weather delays would push afternoon flights into evening slots, and emergency scrambles could disrupt the schedule without warning. She'd learned to read the signs that preceded unusual activity. Increased security presence around specific hangars meant classified aircraft were involved. Extended briefing sessions suggested complex mission profiles. Changes to normal communication protocols indicated operations that required enhanced operational security. Her security clearance gave her access to areas that most base personnel never saw, including the secure hangars where special operations aircraft were maintained. These facilities housed helicopters and transport planes, configured for missions that didn't appear on official flight schedules, aircraft whose capabilities were classified at levels that made routine military operations look like public information. Isabella cleaned these spaces with the same methodical thoroughness she applied everywhere else. But being around special operations aircraft awakened memories she tried to suppress. The smell of specialized fuel additives, the sound of encrypted communication systems running diagnostics, the sight of navigation equipment designed for operations in contested airspace, all of it reminded her of the world she'd been forced to leave behind. The special operations crews treated her with professional courtesy, but maintained the same emotional distance she encountered throughout the base. They had their own reasons for compartmentalizing information and limiting personal relationships. Trust was earned slowly in their community, and a civilian janitor would never earn the kind of trust required for meaningful interaction. But Isabella understood their mindset because she'd lived it for most of her adult life. The constant awareness of security protocols, the automatic assessment of threats and vulnerabilities, the habit of revealing only what was absolutely necessary for mission accomplishment. She recognized it because she'd spent 22 years operating under the same constraints. Her apartment became a refuge where she could temporarily drop the mask of invisibility and remember who she'd been before Peterson. She'd spread aviation charts on her kitchen table and trace flight routes she'd flown in aircraft whose specifications were still classified. She'd read technical journals about advances in aerodynamics and propulsion systems, staying current with developments in fields she could no longer contribute to professionally. Sometimes she'd dream about flying and wake up with her heart racing and her hands automatically reaching for controls that weren't there. The muscle memory of piloting high-performance aircraft was so deeply ingrained that her body would respond to dream scenarios with real physical reactions. She'd find herself calculating airspeed and altitude corrections for situations that existed only in her sleeping mind. The dreams were both torture and solace. They reminded her of capabilities she'd lost, but they also confirmed that her skills hadn't completely atrophied during her years of enforced inactivity. She might be rusty, might need recertification and refresher training, but the fundamental understanding of flight dynamics and aircraft systems remained sharp. Mrs. Peterson, her elderly neighbor, had started inviting Isabella for coffee on weekend mornings. The older woman was lonelier than she admitted, and she'd apparently decided that the quiet janitor from down the hall might appreciate some human company. Isabella accepted these invitations reluctantly at first, then with growing appreciation for conversations that didn't require her to maintain any particular facade. Mrs. Peterson had been married to a career Air Force officer who died 5 years earlier, and she understood military culture well enough to recognize that Isabella was carrying more history than her current job suggested. But she never pressed for details, never asked direct questions about Isabella's background or how she'd ended up cleaning buildings at the same base where her husband had once been stationed. Harold used to say that the Air Force attracted two kinds of people, Mrs. Peterson mentioned during one of their coffee sessions: those who wanted to fly and those who wanted to support the people who flew. But he always said the best ones were the people who could do both. Isabella had nodded politely and changed the subject, but the comment stayed with her. She'd spent her entire career doing both, flying missions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, then sharing that knowledge to help other pilots accomplish their own missions safely. The combination of operational experience and technical expertise had made her valuable in ways that extended far beyond her personal flying achievements. Now she was doing neither. She wasn't flying, wasn't training other pilots, wasn't contributing to aviation safety or mission effectiveness in any meaningful way. She was cleaning buildings and trying to convince herself that invisible service was still service, even when nobody acknowledged it existed. The irony was that Peterson Air Force Base probably needed her expertise more than her current supervisors realized. The base housed training operations for multiple aircraft types, some of them flown by relatively inexperienced pilots who were still learning the difference between confidence and competence. Isabella could have identified safety issues, suggested training improvements, and shared insights that might prevent accidents. But Captain Isabella Restrepo, call sign Phoenix, was officially dead. And the woman who'd taken her place had no credentials, no authority, and no voice in decisions that might determine whether young pilots like Morrison lived long enough to learn from their mistakes. The emergency began at 347 hours on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday for the past 3 years. Isabella was finishing her cleaning route in the administrative wing when the base-wide alert system crackled to life with a tone she hadn't heard since her active duty days, the sharp, urgent blast that meant someone's life was hanging in the balance and every second counted. Alert, alert, alert. All personnel stand by for emergency notification. SAR mission authorization Bravo 77. Repeat, SAR mission authorization Bravo 77. Search and rescue. Isabella's hands stilled on her mop handle as muscle. Memory kicked in and her brain automatically began processing the implications. SAR missions at Peterson meant someone was in trouble somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, probably military personnel whose aircraft had gone down in terrain that would challenge even experienced rescue crews. The base transformed instantly from its usual nighttime quiet to controlled chaos. Emergency lighting systems activated, casting everything in harsh white illumination. Personnel began moving with the purposeful urgency that came from years of drilling for exactly this scenario. Isabella had seen it hundreds of times before, but never from this side of the operation. She should have continued with her work, stayed invisible, minded her own business. Instead, she found herself gravitating toward the Flight Operations Center where the rescue mission would be coordinated. Not close enough to interfere, but near enough to understand what was happening. The details emerged in fragments overheard from radio communications and hurried conversations between personnel rushing past her position. A civilian aircraft had gone down somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, approximately 40 miles southwest of the base. 2 souls on board. Last known position uncertain due to severe weather conditions that had been building throughout the night. The problem was the weather itself. A late-season storm system had moved through the area faster than meteorologists had predicted, bringing snow, ice, and winds that made flying conditions marginal even for experienced mountain pilots. The civilian aircraft, a small Cessna, according to the initial reports, had been caught in the weather while attempting to reach an airport that could accommodate an emergency landing. Isabella listened to the flight operations discussions with growing concern. The rescue mission would require helicopter operations in mountainous terrain during adverse weather conditions, exactly the kind of scenario that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The crew would need to navigate through mountain passes obscured by clouds, locate a crash site that might be hidden by snow, and execute a rescue operation while dealing with unpredictable wind conditions that could slam an aircraft into a mountainside. Without warning, Peterson's R assets included 2 HH-60 Pavehawk helicopters configured for search and rescue operations, along with crews trained for mountain rescue missions. Under normal conditions, they were more than capable of handling this type of emergency. But these weren't normal conditions. The weather briefing painted a grim picture. Visibility near zero in the search area. Wind gusts approaching the operational limits for helicopter flight. Snow accumulation that would make landing sites difficult to identify and potentially dangerous to use. Icing conditions that could affect aircraft performance and compromise flight safety. Major Sarah Chen, the SAR mission commander, was coordinating with the civilian authorities while her crews prepared for launch. Isabella recognized Chen from her previous interactions around the base, a competent officer with solid experience, but someone whose background was primarily in conventional rescue operations, rather than the kind of extreme weather flying this mission would require. The first indication of serious problems came 30 minutes into the mission preparation. Captain Rodriguez, the lead pilot for one of the Pave Hawks, reported during his pre-flight briefing that weather conditions at the suspected crash site were deteriorating faster than forecast. The mountain passes they'd planned to use for ingress were now completely obscured by clouds, and the alternate routes would require flying through areas where terrain clearance margins were uncomfortably thin. Isabella found herself unconsciously evaluating the mission parameters based on fragments of information she was overhearing. The weather conditions were challenging, but not impossible. She'd flown in worse during her test pilot days. The terrain was demanding, but well within the capabilities of experienced mountain pilots. The time factor was critical but manageable. If the crew could locate the crash site quickly, but something felt wrong. Call it intuition, call it experience, call it the kind of situational awareness that came from years of flying missions where small problems could cascade into catastrophic failures if they weren't recognized and addressed early. Isabella couldn't put her finger on exactly what was bothering her, but every instinct she developed over 22 years of aviation was suggesting that this mission was more dangerous than it appeared. The second helicopter crew was having equipment problems. Technical Sergeant Williams was supervising the maintenance team trying to resolve an intermittent failure in the aircraft's navigation system, not a grounding issue under normal circumstances, but potentially serious when flying in mountainous terrain with limited visibility. How long for the repair? Major Chun asked Williams during a brief consultation near Isabella's cleaning position. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe 2 hours, Williams replied with the honesty that came from years of aircraft maintenance experience. These intermittent faults are unpredictable. Could be a loose connection, could be a component failure, could be environmental interference. Won't know until we run more diagnostics. Chun's frustration was visible even from Isabella's peripheral position. 2 souls were somewhere in the mountains, possibly injured, definitely exposed to weather conditions that would kill them if rescue was delayed too long. But launching with degraded equipment could put the rescue crew at risk, potentially turning a 2-person emergency into a larger catastrophe. The decision was made to launch with 1 helicopter while the second aircraft underwent repairs. Not ideal, but acceptable given the urgency of the situation and the capabilities of the Pave Hawk crew. Captain Rodriguez would fly the mission with his standard crew, following the planned route to the suspected crash site and adapting to weather conditions as they developed. Isabella watched the pre-flight preparations with growing unease. She'd participated in enough SAR missions during her active duty years to recognize the signs of a complex operation that was being pushed forward by time pressure rather than pulled forward by optimal conditions. The crew was competent and the equipment was functional, but the margins for error were narrower than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The weather update 20 minutes before launch made things worse. Conditions in the search area had deteriorated beyond the original forecast, with visibility dropping to near zero and wind speeds increasing to levels that would challenge even experienced pilots. The civilian authorities were pressing for immediate launch, emphasizing that survival time for the crash victims was decreasing with every hour of delay. Rodriguez and his crew were reviewing their route options when Isabella overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. They were discussing a navigation approach that would take them through a mountain pass she'd flown during her test pilot days, a route that looked safe on charts but contained wind shear conditions that could destroy an aircraft in seconds. If approached incorrectly, she'd learned about those conditions the hard way during a test flight 8 years earlier, when unexpected downdrafts had nearly slammed her experimental aircraft into the mountainside before she could recover. The terrain created a Venturi effect that accelerated wind speeds and generated turbulence patterns that weren't visible on weather radar. Pilots who didn't know about the hazard could find themselves in an unrecoverable situation before they realized what was happening. Rodriguez didn't know about the wind shear because it wasn't in any of the standard navigation databases. The information existed only in classified test pilot reports that weren't accessible to conventional SAR crews. Isabella was probably the only person at Peterson who had first-hand experience with that particular hazard, and she was pushing a mop bucket instead of sitting in the mission briefing where her knowledge could save lives. The moral calculus was simple and devastating. She could maintain her invisibility and hope that Rodriguez's skill and luck would get him through safely, or she could risk exposure to prevent a potential disaster. Breaking her cover would mean answering questions she couldn't answer, explaining knowledge she wasn't supposed to have, and potentially destroying the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for 3 years. But watching good people die when she had information that could save them wasn't a choice she could live with. The decision crystallized when she heard Rodriguez tell his crew that they'd take the mountain pass route if weather conditions at their primary approach became unmanageable. He was planning to use her knowledge of the terrain hazard as a backup option, not knowing that the backup was more dangerous than the primary route. Isabella set down her mop and walked toward the mission briefing area with the kind of determined stride she hadn't used since her last day as Captain Restrepo. She wasn't sure exactly what she was going to say or how she was going to explain her intervention, but she knew that silence was no longer an option. The 3 years of invisibility were about to end. Whether she was ready or not, Isabella approached the mission briefing area with her heart hammering against her ribs, each step feeling like she was crossing an invisible line that could never be uncrossed. The secure briefing room was buzzing with pre-mission activity pilots reviewing charts, crew chiefs running final equipment checks, weather specialists updating forecasts that seemed to get worse with each revision. Major Chun was standing at the front of the room next to a large tactical display showing the search area, while Captain Rodriguez and his crew gathered around a table covered with approach charts and emergency procedures. The room fell silent as Isabella appeared in the doorway, her cleaning uniform making her presence both obvious and inexplicable. "Ma'am, this is a restricted briefing," Staff Sergeant Collins said, moving to intercept her before she could enter further. "You'll need to return to your cleaning duties." "Wait," Isabella said, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been heard from her in 3 years. "Captain Rodriguez, you're planning to use Corridor 7 Alpha as your alternate approach route." Rodriguez looked up from his charts with surprise and confusion. It wasn't a question. Isabella had stated the route designation with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. The problem was that Corridor 7 Alpha wasn't marked on any of the standard navigation charts he was using. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested professional interest rather than irritation. Something about Isabella's bearing and the specificity of her statement had caught his attention. Major Chun stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "This is one of our janitorial staff. Ma'am, I need you to leave immediately. This is classified mission planning." "Major, with respect, that route will kill your crew," Isabella said, addressing Chun directly but keeping her eyes on Rodriguez. "Corridor 7 Alpha runs through a terrain funnel that creates severe downdrafts and wind shear. The charts don't show it because it's not detectable by standard weather instruments." The room went completely silent. Isabella had just demonstrated knowledge of flight routes that weren't supposed to exist, and weather phenomena that weren't documented in official databases. Everyone present was trying to process how a cleaning lady could possibly know information that wasn't available to qualified rescue crews. Rodriguez set down his charts and studied Isabella with the kind of focused attention that experienced pilots reserve for potential threats to flight safety. "How do you know about Corridor 7 Alpha?" "Because I've flown it," Isabella replied simply, "and I nearly died doing it." Technical Sergeant Williams had been standing near the back of the room, but she moved forward now with an expression that suggested she was seeing Isabella clearly for the first time. "Rest, what exactly is your background?" Isabella looked around the room at faces that ranged from confused to suspicious to increasingly concerned. She'd kept her secret for 3 years, but the lives of 4 rescue crew members were worth more than her anonymity. "My name is Captain Isabella Restrepo, call sign Phoenix," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Former test pilot, Project Aurora, retired with 22 years of service. I've logged more than 4,000 hours in experimental aircraft, including extensive mountain operations in terrain identical to your search area." The silence that followed was so complete that Isabella could hear the ventilation system cycling in the background. Major Chun's face had gone pale, while Rodriguez was staring at her like she'd just claimed to be a ghost. "That's impossible," Chun finally said. "Captain Restrepo was killed in a classified test flight accident 7 years ago. There's a memorial plaque in the Test Pilot Hall of Fame." "The memorial plaque is for operational security," Isabella replied. "I'm very much alive, obviously. And right now, that matters less than the fact that your current flight plan is going to put a Pave Hawk and 4 crew members into terrain they won't be able to recover from." Staff Sergeant Collins was already moving toward the communication console, probably to verify Isabella's claims through official channels, but Rodriguez held up a hand to stop him. "Before we worry about who she is or isn't," Rodriguez said, "I want to hear about these wind conditions. If there's a hazard we don't know about, I need that information regardless of the source." Isabella moved to the tactical display, her movements now confident and purposeful in a way that made her years of invisibility seem like an elaborate performance. She traced the mountain pass route with her finger, identifying specific terrain, features that would interact with prevailing wind patterns. "The problem is the canyon configuration here," she explained, pointing to a narrow valley that appeared benign on the topographic charts. "The mountains create a Venturi effect that accelerates wind speeds by a factor of 3 or 4. When you add the temperature differential between the valley floor and the peaks, you get downdrafts that can exceed 2,000 feet per minute." Rodriguez leaned in closer, studying the terrain Isabella was describing. "That would be unrecoverable in a helicopter. It's barely recoverable in a fixed-wing aircraft with full power available," Isabella confirmed. "I was flying an experimental fighter when I encountered those conditions, and even with afterburners and unlimited maneuvering authority, I came within 50 feet of controlled flight into terrain." Williams had moved to Isabella's other side and was examining the route with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades keeping aircraft safely in the air. "Why isn't this documented in the hazard databases?" "Because the test flights that discovered it were classified above the level where SAR crews would have access," Isabella explained. "The information exists, but it's buried in reports that officially don't exist." Major Chun was clearly struggling with multiple competing priorities, verifying Isabella's identity, assessing the validity of her claims, and maintaining mission schedule in the face of deteriorating weather conditions. "Even if what you're saying is accurate, we still have 2 people in those mountains who are going to die if we don't get to them soon. Which is why you need to use the northern approach. Through Sector 4 Bravo," Isabella said, moving her finger to a different route on the display. "It adds 12 minutes to your flight time, but it avoids the worst of the terrain hazards and gives you better escape routes if weather conditions deteriorate further." Rodriguez was nodding as he traced the alternate route. "That approach would put us over the ridge line here, which gives us better radar coverage of the search area. And it approaches the crash site from upwind, which will make the rescue insertion safer," Isabella added. "The downdrafts I'm warning you about work both ways. If you approach from the south, you'll be fighting updrafts that could slam you into the mountainside just as easily as downdrafts. The radio crackled with an update from the civilian search authorities. Weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and survival estimates for the crash victims were dropping rapidly. The pressure to launch immediately was increasing, but so was the evidence that Isabella's warnings needed to be taken seriously. Collins had completed his verification checks and returned with information that made everyone in the room reconsider their assumptions. "Ma'am, there's a Captain Isabella Restrepo in the classified personnel database. Service record shows extensive test pilot experience, but status is listed as deceased with no date of death provided. Administrative fiction," Isabella said without elaborating further. "The point is that I'm qualified to give you tactical advice, and right now that advice is that your primary flight plan has a significant probability of killing your entire crew." Rodriguez was studying both routes now, comparing approach angles and terrain clearances with the kind of methodical analysis that separated competent pilots from dead ones. "The northern route does look safer from a navigation standpoint. Better terrain clearance, more options for emergency landing sites. It's also longer," Chun pointed out. "Every minute we delay reduces the chances of finding those people alive. Every minute we spend recovering our own wreckage reduces those chances to zero," Isabella replied. "Dead rescue crews can't save anyone." Williams stepped forward with the kind of practical authority that came from years of keeping pilots alive through good maintenance and sound judgment. "Major, I recommend we adjust the flight plan based on this information. Captain Restrepo's credentials appear legitimate, and her tactical assessment matches what I'm seeing in the terrain analysis. The decision crystallized in the way that critical choices often do, not through lengthy deliberation, but through the accumulation of evidence that made one option clearly superior to the alternatives." Rodriguez was already updating his charts with the northern route when Major Chun gave her official approval. "We'll use Sector 4 Bravo for primary approach," Chun announced to the room. "Adjust navigation programming accordingly and update emergency procedures for the new route." Isabella started to step back from the display, her temporary role as tactical advisor apparently complete. But Rodriguez caught her attention with a question that changed everything. "Captain Restrepo, what's your current flight status?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella's official answer should have been that she was retired, medically disqualified, or administratively separated. But Rodriguez was asking because he was thinking tactically, and tactical thinking sometimes required resources that weren't available through normal channels. "Complicated," Isabella replied, which was both completely honest and utterly inadequate. "Because we just lost our backup aircraft to equipment failure," Rodriguez continued, "and weather conditions are going to challenge even experienced mountain pilots. If you're current and qualified, we could use another pilot on this mission." Isabella stared at him, trying to process the implications of what he was suggesting. 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of accepting that her flying career was over, 3 years of cleaning floors instead of pushing the envelope of human flight capability. And now Rodriguez was offering her the chance to do what she'd been trained to do, what she'd lived for, what she'd thought was lost forever. "I haven't flown in 3 years," she said quietly. "But you still remember how?" Isabella looked around the room at faces that were no longer seeing the janitor, but were beginning to see the pilot she'd once been. The weight of their attention was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Yeah," she said finally. "I still remember how." The transformation began before Isabella even left the briefing room. Major Chun was already on the secure phone with Wing Command, explaining why a supposedly dead test pilot was about to be pressed into emergency service for a critical rescue mission. The conversation was terse, professional, and conducted in the kind of military shorthand that conveyed maximum information with minimum words. "Sir, we have a unique situation requiring immediate personnel authorization," Chun was saying while Rodriguez pulled Isabella aside to discuss aircraft assignment and crew coordination. Request emergency flight status activation for Captain Isabella Restrepo, service number 7-7-4-9-2-1-Alpha. Isabella felt something shifting inside her chest as she heard her service number spoken aloud for the first time in 3 years. It was more than just a string of digits. It was proof that Captain Restrepo had existed, that her 22 years of service hadn't been completely erased by administrative convenience and operational security requirements. Rodriguez was scrolling through aircraft availability reports on his tablet, looking for options that would put Isabella in the air without compromising the primary rescue mission. We've got a reserve Pave Hawk that's mission capable, but not configured for SAR operations. Basic navigation package, standard communication. Sweet, but no specialized rescue equipment. That's fine, Isabella replied, her mind already shifting into pre-flight planning mode. I don't need to do the actual rescue. I need to provide overwatch and backup navigation for your crew. The concept was sound from a tactical standpoint. Isabella would fly a support role, using her knowledge of local terrain hazards to guide the primary rescue aircraft through the safest possible routes. If weather conditions deteriorated beyond the capabilities of standard navigation equipment, her experience with extreme weather flying could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But first, she needed to prove she could still fly. Technical Sergeant Williams was already moving toward the equipment lockers, pulling flight gear that would fit Isabella's frame. The process felt surreal, trading her cleaning coveralls for a flight suit, replacing her worn work boots with regulation flight boots, strapping on equipment she hadn't worn since her last day as an active pilot. Ma'am, you're going to need current medical clearance before you can be authorized for flight status, Staff Sergeant Collins pointed out, consulting the thick manual of regulations that governed emergency flight operations. Medical clearance waived under emergency authority, Chen replied, still holding the secure phone. Wing Commander is authorizing temporary flight status based on operational necessity. Isabella was checking the fit of her borrowed helmet when the full magnitude of what was happening finally hit her. 3 years ago, she'd walked away from flying convinced that she'd never sit in a cockpit again. Now she was preparing for a rescue mission in weather conditions that would challenge pilots with current experience and recent training. The smart thing would be to admit that 3 years away from active flying had degraded her skills beyond the point where she could safely contribute to a critical mission. The responsible thing would be to step back and let the qualified, current pilots handle the rescue while she provided ground-based support. But 2 people were dying in the mountains, and the primary rescue crew was about to fly into terrain hazards that could kill them all. Rodriguez finished his aircraft assignment coordination and turned back to Isabella with the kind of focused intensity that meant they were past the point of theoretical discussion. Aircraft 779 is fueled and ready. Basic flight configuration, standard emergency equipment, full communication package. You'll be flying chase position, providing navigation backup and weather reconnaissance. Copy that, Isabella replied, the military acknowledgement feeling natural despite 3 years of disuse. What's my call sign for this mission? Phoenix, Rodriguez said without hesitation. Seemed appropriate. The walk to the aircraft felt like moving through a dream. Every step was familiar yet strange, like returning to a childhood home after decades away. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid triggered memories so vivid that Isabella could almost see her younger self preparing for test flights that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Aircraft 779 was a standard HS-60 Pave Hawk, configured for search and rescue operations, but currently loaded with minimal mission-specific equipment. Isabella began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had been drilled into her during 22 years of military aviation, checking systems and components with muscle memory that hadn't faded despite her extended absence. From active flying, the aircraft was in excellent condition. which didn't surprise her given Technical Sergeant Williams' reputation for maintenance excellence. Every system Isabella checked was within normal parameters. Every component showed signs of proper care and routine maintenance. The Pave Hawk was ready to fly. The question was whether Isabella was ready to fly it. She'd maintained her flight. Physical requirements during her 3 years at Peterson, partly from habit and partly from hope that someday her flying career might be restored. Her vision was still sharp, her reflexes were still quick, and her understanding of aircraft systems remained current through constant study of technical manuals and aviation publications. But knowledge and skill weren't the same thing. Flying was a perishable skill that required constant practice to maintain peak proficiency. 3 years away from active flying meant that Isabella's hands might remember the movements, but her timing could be off by fractions of seconds that mattered. When dealing with emergency situations, Rodriguez appeared at Isabella's shoulder as she completed her external inspection. "How are you feeling about this?" "Nervous," Isabella admitted. "But ready." "Good. Nervous pilots make fewer mistakes than overconfident ones." They reviewed the mission profile one more time before engine start. Rodriguez would lead the formation. In Aircraft 776, configured with full rescue equipment and specialized navigation systems, Isabella would fly chase position in 779, maintaining communication with both the rescue aircraft and base operations while providing backup navigation and weather reconnaissance. The plan was straightforward. Fly the northern route. Isabella had recommended locate the crash site using a combination of emergency beacon signals and visual search. Then execute the rescue while Isabella maintained overwatch from a safe distance. If weather conditions deteriorated beyond safe limits, both aircraft would return to base and wait for conditions to improve. Isabella strapped into the pilot's seat with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. The cockpit layout was familiar. Despite cosmetic differences from aircraft she'd flown during her active career, the basic controls were in the same positions. The instrument displays showed the same information, and the startup procedures followed the same logical sequence she'd memorized decades earlier. Engine start was smooth and routine. Systems checks revealed no discrepancies. Flight controls responded normally to her inputs. The aircraft was ready to fly, and despite her 3-year absence from active duty, Isabella found that her body remembered how to be a pilot. Peterson Tower, Phoenix 01, ready for departure, she transmitted, using her call sign for the first time in 3 years. Phoenix 01, Peterson Tower, cleared for takeoff runway 03. Winds 040 at 15, gusts to 25. Contact departure control on frequency 128.7. Isabella acknowledged the clearance and began her takeoff roll, feeling the familiar sensation of an aircraft transitioning from ground vehicle to flying machine. The Pave Hawk lifted off smoothly, responding to her control inputs with the precision she remembered from her active flying days. As Peterson Air Force Base fell away beneath her, Isabella realized that something fundamental had changed in the past hour. She was no longer the invisible janitor who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans. She was Captain Isabella Restrepo again, call sign Phoenix, and she was exactly where she belonged. The Colorado mountains stretched below Isabella's aircraft like a 3-dimensional maze of granite and snow, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Flying at 8,000 feet above sea level, with peaks rising another 4,000 feet around her, she was navigating through terrain that had humbled pilots far more experienced than the young aviators who typically flew SAR missions. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her headset as they approached the search area. Phoenix 01, lead. The weather is deteriorating faster than forecast. Visibility dropping to less than half a mile in the target area. Isabella checked her instruments and confirmed what Rodriguez was seeing. The storm system was intensifying, creating conditions that would challenge even pilots with extensive mountain flying experience. Snow was beginning to accumulate on her windscreen, despite the anti-ice systems, and turbulence was increasing as they climbed toward the higher terrain. "Lead, Phoenix. Recommend we split our search pattern," Isabella transmitted. "I'll take the eastern quadrant, where the terrain is more complex. Your rescue configuration is better suited for the western approach vectors." It was a tactical decision, based on aircraft capabilities and mission requirements, but it also reflected Isabella's growing confidence in her ability to handle the more challenging flying conditions. Her aircraft was lighter and more maneuverable without the rescue equipment, making it better suited for flying in the tight mountain valleys where the civilian aircraft might have gone down. Rodriguez acknowledged her recommendation and adjusted his search pattern accordingly. Isabella banked east toward the most difficult terrain, feeling the aircraft respond crisply to her control inputs despite the increasingly turbulent air. Flying was coming back to her with startling speed muscle memory, combining with intellectual knowledge to restore capabilities she'd thought were permanently lost. The search grid covered approximately 40 square miles of mountainous terrain, much of it above the tree line where snow accumulation made visual identification of aircraft wreckage extremely difficult. Isabella flew systematic search patterns at varying altitudes, using both visual scanning and electronic detection equipment to locate any sign of the missing Cessna. 20 minutes into the search, she encountered the wind conditions she'd warned Rodriguez about earlier. Flying through a narrow valley that appeared safe on navigation charts, Isabella suddenly found her aircraft caught in downdrafts that threatened to slam her into the valley floor despite full power application. The pave Hawk shuddered and dropped 300 feet in less than 5 seconds, its engines screaming as Isabella fought to regain altitude. The downdrafts were exactly as severe as she'd predicted, powerful enough to overwhelm the helicopter's climb performance and potentially fatal for pilots who weren't prepared for them. "Lead, Phoenix. Confirming severe downdrafts in corridor 7 Alpha. Recommend all aircraft avoid this area completely," Isabella transmitted while climbing back to safe altitude. "Phoenix Lead. Copy your downdraft report. Are you experiencing any aircraft damage?" Isabella completed a quick systems check and confirmed that her aircraft was undamaged despite the violent encounter with the mountain winds. The experience had validated her warnings about terrain hazards, but more importantly, it had proven that her flying skills were still sharp enough to handle emergency situations that could have destroyed both aircraft and crew. The search continued for another 40 minutes before Isabella spotted something that made her blood run cold. Not the missing Cessna, something much worse. Rodriguez's aircraft was approaching the exact terrain features that created the downdraft conditions, following a search pattern that would take him directly into the wind shear zone. "Lead, Phoenix. Immediate vector change required. You're approaching a severe downdraft area from the south. Recommend immediate turn to heading 270. Phoenix Lead. I'm not showing any weather hazards on my instruments." Isabella could see what Rodriguez couldn't, the subtle visual cues that indicated dangerous wind conditions ahead. Cloud formations that suggested severe turbulence, snow patterns that revealed the direction and intensity of surface winds, terrain. Features that would create the Venturi effect she'd experienced firsthand. "Lead, trust me on this. Execute an immediate turn now." Rodriguez's aircraft began turning just as Isabella spotted the missing Cessna. The civilian aircraft had crashed on a narrow ledge approximately 2,000 feet below her current altitude, partially hidden by snow accumulation but visible enough to confirm that it was the target of their search mission. "Lead, Phoenix. Target acquired. Bearing 095, distance 2 miles from my current position. Civilian aircraft on terrain shelf. Elevation approximately 6,500 feet. Isabella marked the crash site coordinates and began circling at a safe distance while Rodriguez repositioned his aircraft for rescue approach. The Cessna appeared to be intact despite the forced landing, and Isabella could see movement near the aircraft that suggested at least one survivor was still alive. The rescue insertion would be challenging under the best circumstances. The terrain. Shelf where the Cessna had landed was barely wide enough to accommodate a helicopter landing, with steep drop-offs on 3 sides and unstable snow conditions that could shift without warning. Adding the deteriorating weather conditions made the rescue attempt extremely dangerous for both the survivors and the rescue crew. Rodriguez began his approach to the crash site with the methodical precision that marked experienced SAR pilots. Isabella maintained an overwatch position, monitoring weather conditions and terrain hazards while providing navigation backup for the rescue aircraft. Phoenix lead, beginning rescue approach. Winds at the crash site are gusting to 30 knots, with variable direction. Isabella watched Rodriguez's aircraft descend toward the narrow shelf, fighting wind conditions that were pushing the helicopter dangerously close to the terrain features surrounding the crash site. The rescue was technically feasible, but the margins for error were razor thin. That's when everything went wrong. Wind shear condition that neither pilot had anticipated caught Rodriguez's aircraft during the final approach phase. The Pave Hawk dropped suddenly, its rotor disc coming within inches of striking the rocky outcropping that formed the eastern edge of the landing area. Rodriguez fought to regain control while his crew prepared for what looked like an inevitable crash. Isabella reacted without conscious thought, her years of test pilot experience taking over as she dove her aircraft toward the rescue site. She wasn't planning a rescue herself. Her aircraft wasn't configured for that mission, but she could provide wind information and possibly assist with the emergency recovery. Lead Phoenix. Wind shear from the northeast. Recommend immediate climb and abort approach. Rodriguez's aircraft was climbing away from the terrain, but Isabella could see that the wind conditions were only getting worse. The rescue attempt had failed, and weather conditions were deteriorating to the point where a second approach would be suicidal. But the survivors were still down there, still alive and still depending on them for rescue. Isabella made a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Despite having an aircraft that wasn't configured for rescue operations, despite not having flown in 3 years, despite operating in weather conditions that challenged even experienced crews, she was going to attempt the rescue herself. Lead Phoenix, I'm going in. Phoenix negative. Your aircraft isn't configured for rescue operations. Lead, I've got a smaller aircraft and better maneuverability in these conditions. I can make this work. Isabella was already beginning her descent toward the crash site, calculating approach angles and wind corrections with the kind of precision that had made her one of the Air Force's most capable test pilots. The rescue wouldn't be textbook, but it would be possible if she could land on that narrow shelf without destroying her aircraft in the process. Isabella's descent toward the crash site was a masterclass in precision, flying under impossible conditions. Every control input had to be perfect, too aggressive and the wind shear would slam her into the mountainside. Too conservative, and she'd lose the narrow window of opportunity to reach the survivors before weather conditions made rescue impossible. Approach required threading her helicopter between rock formations that left less than 50 feet of clearance on either side. Isabella had flown similar approaches during her test pilot days, but never in weather this severe and never with so much at stake. The survivors below were depending on her ability to execute a landing that most pilots would consider suicidal. Phoenix. Lead, your approach angle is too steep. Recommend abort and climb. Rodriguez was watching Isabella's descent with the professional concern of a pilot who understood exactly how dangerous her approach was becoming. But Isabella had calculated the mathematics of the situation, and she knew that a conventional approach wouldn't work in these wind conditions. Lead Phoenix. I need the steep angle to maintain directional control in the crosswind, she transmitted while fighting wind gusts that were trying to push her aircraft into the terrain. Standard approach profiles won't work with these wind shear conditions. The Cessna was directly below her now, and Isabella could see two figures near the aircraft, waving frantically at her approaching helicopter. One person appeared to be supporting the other, suggesting injuries that would complicate the rescue process. Her aircraft wasn't equipped with medical equipment or rescue hoists, which meant she'd have to land and load the survivors manually. Landing zone was even smaller than it had appeared from altitude. The rocky shelf where the Cessna had come to rest was barely 60 feet long and perhaps 30 feet wide, with loose snow that could hide unstable ground conditions. Landing a helicopter in that space would require placing her aircraft within inches of the optimal position. Any deviation could result in rotor strike, ground resonance, or sliding off the shelf into a 1,000-foot drop. Isabella began her final approach with the kind of focused concentration that came from years of flying aircraft at the absolute limits of their performance envelopes. Wind conditions were fluctuating wildly, requiring constant corrections to maintain her intended flight path. Snow was reducing visibility to less than 100 feet, forcing her to rely on instruments and intuition rather than visual reference. Points. The helicopter touched down with a precision that surprised even Isabella. Despite the challenging conditions, she'd managed to place the aircraft exactly where it needed to be, close enough to the survivors for rapid loading, but far enough from the terrain edges to avoid disaster if wind gusts shifted the aircraft's position. She kept the engines running at flight idle, ready for immediate takeoff if conditions deteriorated further. Through her side window, she could see the two survivors struggling through snow toward her aircraft. One was clearly injured, moving with the careful deliberation of someone dealing with significant pain. Isabella opened her crew door and jumped out to assist with the evacuation, immediately understanding why the rescue was taking longer than anticipated. The injured survivor was a woman in her 60s with what appeared to be a broken leg, while her companion was a man roughly the same age who was exhausted from supporting her weight through deep snow. "I'm Captain Restrepo, Air Force." "Sir," Isabella shouted over the engine noise and wind. "We need to move fast. Weather conditions are deteriorating." The man nodded gratefully while Isabella helped support the injured woman. "I'm Dr. Harrison. This is my wife, Margaret. She's got a compound fracture of the left tibia and possible internal injuries from the crash impact." Isabella assessed the situation quickly. Dr. Harrison appeared uninjured, but was showing signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. Margaret Harrison was in serious condition, but stable enough for transport if they could get her into the aircraft quickly. The bigger problem was that Isabella's helicopter wasn't configured with medical equipment that could properly immobilize fracture injuries during flight. "Doctor, I need you to support your wife's leg during loading," Isabella instructed. "My aircraft doesn't have medical restraints, so you'll have to maintain manual stabilization throughout the flight." They managed to get both survivors into the helicopter's cargo compartment, with Dr. Harrison holding his wife's injured leg in position while Isabella secured them with the basic restraint system. It wasn't ideal from a medical standpoint, but it was better than leaving them on the mountain to die from exposure. Isabella was climbing back into the pilot's seat when the weather took another turn for the worse. Wind speeds increased dramatically, and visibility dropped to near zero as heavy snow began falling. The conditions that had been challenging during her approach were now becoming genuinely dangerous. Lead Phoenix. 2 survivors on board, preparing for immediate departure. Weather conditions are below minimums for safe flight. Phoenix Lead. Recommend you hold position until conditions improve. Isabella looked at the injured woman in her cargo compartment and realized that holding wasn't an option. Margaret Harrison needed medical attention immediately, and the shelf where they were positioned wasn't stable enough for extended ground operations. If the weather didn't improve soon, they'd all be trapped until conditions cleared, which might be hours or days. "Lead, I'm coming out now. Dr. Harrison says his wife has internal injuries that require immediate surgical intervention." The takeoff was even more challenging than the landing had been. Isabella had to lift the helicopter straight up from the narrow shelf without drifting into the surrounding terrain, then transitioned to forward flight in conditions that provided almost no visual reference points. She was flying by instruments and instinct, using her years of experience with experimental aircraft to navigate through weather that would have grounded most civilian pilots. Rodriguez's voice provided reassurance as Isabella climbed away from the crash site. Phoenix lead, I've got you on radar. Vector heading 280 for return to base. Peterson is reporting improved weather conditions for recovery. The flight back to Peterson took 35 minutes that felt like hours. Isabella fought constant turbulence and wind shear while monitoring her passengers, conditioned through periodic checks. Dr. Harrison was doing his best to keep his wife stable, but it was clear that she needed professional medical care urgently. Isabella's hands were cramping from gripping the controls so tightly, and her shoulders ached from fighting the aircraft's tendency to drift in the crosswinds. But her passengers were alive, her aircraft was performing normally, and Peterson Air Force Base was getting closer with each mile. Peterson Tower, Phoenix 01, emergency medical evacuation, 2 souls on board, requesting priority handling, and a medical team standing by. Phoenix 01, Peterson Tower, cleared straight in approach runway 03. Medical team is standing by at the flight line. Weather at Peterson is improving, wind 060 at 12 knots, visibility 4 miles in light snow. Isabella could see the base's runway lights cutting through the snow as she approached for landing. After 3 years of believing her flying career was over, she was completing one of the most challenging missions of her entire career. The woman who'd been invisible for so long had just reminded everyone why Captain Isabella Restrepo had been considered one of the Air Force's most capable pilots. The helicopter settled onto the tarmac with the kind of gentle touchdown that marked a pilot who understood her aircraft completely. Medical personnel were already running toward the aircraft as Isabella began shutting down systems. The rescue mission was complete, but Isabella suspected that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The medical team swarmed Isabella's helicopter before the rotors had completely stopped turning. Dr. Harrison and his wife were transferred to waiting stretchers with the kind of professional efficiency that marked Peterson's emergency response capabilities. Isabella completed her post-flight shutdown procedures while watching the medical evacuation unfold, feeling the familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that came from completing a successful mission under challenging conditions. Major Chun appeared at Isabella's aircraft door as she was securing the cockpit for post-flight inspection. The mission commander's expression was unreadable, but Isabella could sense the weight of questions that needed answers now that the immediate emergency was over. Captain Restrepo, we need to debrief this mission immediately, Chun said, with the kind of formal tone that suggested official procedures were about to take precedence over operational expediency. There are significant administrative issues that require resolution. Isabella nodded and followed Chen toward the operations building, her borrowed flight gear feeling strange after 3 years of wearing janitor coveralls. Other base personnel were watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to confusion to something approaching awe. Word had spread quickly about the cleaning lady, who'd turned out to be a decorated test pilot. The debrief took place in the same secure conference room where Isabella had first revealed her identity 6 hours earlier. Rodriguez was there, along with Technical Sergeant Williams, Staff Sergeant Collins, and several officers Isabella didn't recognize. Their insignia suggested they were senior personnel from Wing Headquarters, probably summoned to deal with the security implications of a supposedly dead pilot suddenly appearing on active flight status. Let's start with the operational aspects, Chun began, consulting notes she'd taken during the mission. Captain Restrepo, your tactical assessment of terrain hazards proved accurate. The downdraft conditions you warned about were confirmed by both aircraft during the search phase. Isabella provided a detailed technical briefing on the wind shear phenomena. explaining how terrain features created dangerous flying conditions that weren't documented in standard navigation databases. Her analysis was professional and thorough. Drawing on years of test pilot experience with extreme weather flying, Rodriguez added his perspective on the rescue operation itself. Captain Restrepo's approach to the crash site was technically excellent given the conditions. The landing zone was marginal for helicopter operations, but she executed the approach with precision that allowed successful survivor recovery. "What about your aircraft configuration?" asked one of the wing officers Isabella didn't recognize. "You completed a medical evacuation using an aircraft that wasn't equipped for that mission. The aircraft had basic life support capabilities and adequate space for 2 passengers," Isabella replied. Dr. Harrison provided medical stabilization during flight, which compensated for the lack of specialized medical equipment. Under the circumstances, it was an acceptable risk given the urgency of the situation. The technical aspects of the mission were straightforward enough to document and analyze. The administrative complications were considerably more complex. Isabella had been officially declared dead for security reasons. Her service records were classified above the level where most personnel could access them. And her sudden reappearance on active flight status raised questions that couldn't be answered in standard military channels. Colonel Davidson appeared in the conference room doorway with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he'd been summoned from higher headquarters to deal with the situation personally. Isabella recognized him immediately. He was the same officer who'd interviewed her 3 years earlier when her cover had first been established. "Captain Restrepo," Davidson said with a slight smile that suggested he wasn't entirely surprised to see her. "I understand you've had an eventful evening." "Yes, sir. The rescue mission was successful. 2 civilians recovered from the mountain crash site, both survivors transported to medical facilities for treatment." Davidson took a seat at the conference table and opened a file that looked suspiciously like the classified dossier Isabella remembered from their previous meeting. "Before we discuss the mission itself, we need to address your current status. According to official records, Captain Isabella Restrepo died in a classified aircraft accident. Yet here you are, having just completed a successful rescue operation." "Sir, my official status has been administratively convenient, but operationally inaccurate," Isabella replied carefully. "I've been working at Peterson under civilian cover for security reasons related to my previous assignments. And now that cover has been compromised by operational necessity," Davidson observed. "Which creates interesting options for your future employment." Isabella felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The conversation was moving beyond simple mission debrief toward discussions about her long-term status and potential return to active duty. After 3 years of believing her flying career was permanently over, the possibility of restoration felt both thrilling and terrifying. "The Air Force has been tracking your situation since you accepted the Peterson assignment," Davidson continued. "Your performance as a civilian employee has been exemplary, and your technical knowledge has remained current despite your absence from active flying status." Rodriguez leaned forward with obvious interest. "Sir, if I may, Captain Restrepo's flying performance tonight was outstanding. Her aircraft handling skills and tactical decision-making were at the level I'd expect from our most experienced pilots. Which raises the question of whether the Air Force made an error in forcing her retirement 3 years ago," Davidson said with the kind of careful phrasing that suggested higher level review of previous decisions. Isabella had spent 3 years accepting that her military career was over, that the security requirements of her test pilot background made return to active duty impossible. The suggestion that circumstances might have changed felt like a possibility. She didn't dare hope for. Technical Sergeant Williams spoke up from her position at the side of the room. "Sir, Peterson could use someone with Captain Restrepo's experience and qualifications. Our training programs would benefit significantly from her expertise." And our SAR capabilities would be enhanced by having a pilot with her mountain flying experience, Rodriguez added. Tonight's mission demonstrated skills that aren't available through standard training programs. Davidson closed the file and looked directly at Isabella. Captain, the question is whether you're interested in returning to active duty. Your security clearances can be restored, your flight status can be reactivated, and your service record can be corrected to reflect accurate information about your capabilities and qualifications. Isabella stared at him, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. 3 years of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. 3 years of being invisible and unacknowledged. 3 years of believing that her expertise and experience would never again serve any useful purpose. And now she was being offered the chance to reclaim the identity that had been taken from her. Sir, what would be my assignment and duties? Initially, instructor pilot for advanced mountain rescue operations, Davidson replied. Long term, we're developing new programs that could use your test pilot background and experimental aircraft experience. Isabella looked around the room at faces that were no longer seeing a janitor or a security risk, but were seeing a resource that could contribute meaningfully to mission accomplishment. The invisible woman who'd cleaned their buildings for 3 years was being offered the chance to become visible again. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I'm very interested in returning to active duty. Davidson smiled and reopened his file. Excellent. We'll begin processing your reactivation paperwork immediately. Welcome back, Captain Restrepo. 6 months later, Captain Isabella Restrepo stood in front of a classroom filled with young pilots who hung on her every word like their lives depended on it, which, in many cases, they did. The Advanced Mountain Rescue Operations course had become one of the most sought-after training programs at Peterson, partly because of its reputation for excellence and partly because students knew they were learning from someone who had literally written the book on extreme weather flying. The classroom was equipped with state-of-the-art simulation equipment that allowed Isabella to recreate the exact conditions her students would face during real rescue operations. Weather patterns, terrain features, aircraft performance limitations, everything could be modeled with precision that would have been impossible during her original test pilot days. Today we're going to discuss wind shear recognition and recovery procedures, Isabella announced to her current class of 12 pilots. These are the conditions that kill more mountain rescue crews than equipment failure and pilot error combined. Lieutenant Morrison was among her students, though his attitude had undergone a complete transformation since learning that the cleaning lady he'd mocked was actually one of the Air Force's most decorated pilots. The cocky young aviator who'd joked about pathetic cleaning crews now listened to Isabella's instruction with the respect due someone who'd saved more lives than he'd ever flown missions. Ma'am, can you walk us through the decision-making process during the Harrison rescue? Morrison asked during the lesson on high-risk approach procedures. How did you calculate the risk versus benefit of attempting that landing? Isabella pulled up the terrain analysis from that night's mission, displaying the crash site location and weather conditions on the classroom's main screen. The mathematical calculation was straightforward. 2 people would die without immediate rescue. Weather conditions were deteriorating beyond safe limits for conventional approach procedures, and the available equipment wasn't configured for the mission profile. She traced the approach vector she'd used, explaining how terrain features had influenced her tactical decisions. But the real calculation wasn't mathematical. It was experiential. I'd flown similar approaches during test operations, so I knew the aircraft could handle conditions that would challenge less experienced pilots. The class followed her analysis with focused attention, taking notes on decision trees and risk assessment procedures that could mean the difference between successful rescue and catastrophic failure. Isabella had discovered that teaching was almost as satisfying as flying. She was passing on knowledge that would keep young pilots alive, while helping them develop the judgment that separated competent aviators from exceptional ones. Technical. Sergeant Williams had become one of Isabella's closest collaborators, helping design training scenarios that reflected real-world maintenance challenges crews might encounter during rescue operations. Their partnership had evolved into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to aviation. Safety. Captain, the new pilots need to understand how aircraft performance degrades in high-altitude conditions, Williams mentioned during one of their planning sessions. Too many of them are coming from sea-level training environments, where power margins are much more forgiving. Isabella incorporated Williams' feedback into training modules that emphasized the relationship between altitude, weather, and aircraft. Capabilities. The goal was to give pilots the technical knowledge they needed to make sound tactical decisions when lives were at stake. Her apartment had undergone a complete transformation, reflecting her return to active duty and renewed sense of purpose. The aviation photographs were displayed prominently now, joined by pictures from recent training exercises and rescue missions. The technical manuals had multiplied, covering advances in helicopter technology and rescue procedures that had developed during her 3 years away from active duty. Mrs. Peterson remained a close friend, though their relationship had evolved as Isabella's circumstances changed. The elderly woman was proud of her neighbor's dramatic career restoration, but she also missed the quiet companionship they'd shared during Isabella's invisible years. "I always knew you were more than you appeared to be," Mrs. Peterson said. During one of their weekend coffee sessions, Harold used to say that the best military people were the ones who could adapt to any situation. "You certainly proved that." Oscar, the retired military working dog, had become something of a mascot for Isabella's training program. The German Shepherd would accompany her to work when regulations permitted, serving as a living reminder that military service took many forms and that retirement didn't diminish the value of previous contributions. The base's social dynamics had shifted dramatically since Isabella's identity revelation. Pilots who'd never acknowledged her existence now sought her advice on technical flying matters. Maintenance crews included her in discussions about aircraft performance issues. Administrative personnel treated her with the respect due an officer rather than the indifference typically shown to support staff. But the most significant change was Isabella's own sense of identity and purpose. She was no longer the invisible woman cleaning buildings while her expertise went unrecognized. She was contributing meaningfully to mission accomplishment, training the next generation of rescue pilots, and using her unique combination of experience and knowledge to save lives. Major Sean had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and had specifically requested Isabella's assignment to her command. Their working relationship had evolved from the awkward circumstances of that first emergency briefing to a professional partnership based on shared commitment to rescue operations excellence. "Your training program has reduced our accident rate by 30%, Chun mentioned during Isabella's 6-month performance review. "More importantly, your students are demonstrating decision-making capabilities that typically take years to develop." Isabella accepted the praise while recognizing that her success was built on the foundation of experience that had cost her so much to acquire. The knowledge she was sharing had been earned through decades of flying missions that pushed human and mechanical capabilities to their absolute limits. Rodriguez had become a frequent collaborator, helping Isabella design advanced training scenarios that challenged even experienced pilots. Their professional relationship had deepened into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to risk everything for mission accomplishment. The experimental aircraft programs that had originally led to Isabella's forced retirement were still classified, but her current position allowed her to contribute to aviation safety research in ways that honored her previous service without compromising operational security. She was writing technical papers on extreme weather flying, developing training standards for high-risk rescue operations, and consulting on aircraft design improvements that would enhance crew survivability. 3 years of invisibility had ended. But the lessons learned during that period continued to influence Isabella's approach to leadership and instruction. She understood what it meant to be overlooked, to have expertise dismissed because of assumptions about background and capability. That understanding made her a better teacher and a more effective advocate for excellence, regardless of where it was found. The woman who had once been forced to disappear was now more visible than ever, but on her own terms and in service to missions that mattered. Captain Isabella Restrepo, call sign Phoenix, had risen from the ashes of her previous career to become exactly what she'd always been, one of the Air Force's most capable pilots and most valuable resources. Looking back, Isabella realized that the 3 years of cleaning floors and emptying trash cans hadn't been wasted time. They'd been preparing for a different kind of service, one that valued substance over appearance and contribution over recognition. She'd learned that true worth wasn't diminished by circumstances, and that excellence would eventually be recognized, even when it came from the most unexpected sources. The invisible woman had become visible again, but she'd never forgotten what it felt like to be overlooked. That memory made her a better leader, a more effective teacher, and a stronger advocate for recognizing potential wherever it might be found. Sometimes the most extraordinary people were hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see who they really were. 2 years after her dramatic return to active duty, Captain Isabella Restrepo received a call that would have seemed impossible during her janitor days. The Pentagon needed her expertise for a classified rescue mission, not as backup support, but as mission commander. An experimental aircraft had gone down in the Himalayas during a joint training exercise with Allied forces. The terrain was more challenging than the Colorado Rockies. The weather conditions were beyond what most pilots had ever experienced, and the crew's survival window was measured in hours, not days. "We need someone who understands both experimental aircraft systems and extreme mountain rescue operations," the briefing officer explained. "There's only one pilot in the Air Force with that specific combination of qualifications." Isabella smiled as she accepted the mission assignment. 3 years ago, she'd been invisible, her expertise dismissed and her contributions ignored. Now, she was being asked to lead the most challenging rescue operation of her career because nobody else had the skills required for success. The mission launched 12 hours later with Isabella commanding a joint task force that included pilots from 3 different countries. Her call sign Phoenix had become legendary among rescue crews, representing the kind of excellence that emerged from adversity and the power of recognizing potential wherever it existed. As her aircraft climbed toward the mountains that would test every skill she developed over 25 years of military aviation, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Sometimes the people who seemed most ordinary were actually extraordinary, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true capabilities. The invisible woman had become a leader, whose visibility inspired others to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the hidden potential in everyone around them. If this story inspired you to look twice at the people around you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone in your life was far more remarkable than they first appeared? Your story might be the next one we tell.